The story of Alexander does not begin with conquest. It begins with preparation, with a world already shaped by power, ambition, and long-standing rivalries. By the time Alexander took his place as leader, the path ahead of him had already been influenced by forces that had been building for years. To understand the scale of what would follow, it is important to look at the position he inherited. Macedonia, once seen as a peripheral kingdom by the major Greek city-states, had grown into a powerful force under strong leadership. Its army had been reorganized, trained, and refined into a system that combined discipline with flexibility. This was not an accidental development, but the result of careful planning and sustained effort. The Macedonian military was different from those around it. Its infantry was structured in a way that allowed for both strength and coordination, while its cavalry provided speed and precision. Together, these elements created a force capable of adapting to different situations. This adaptability would become one of the defining features of Alexander's campaigns. Beyond the military, there was also a broader vision. The idea of expanding beyond the traditional boundaries of the Greek world had already begun to take shape. The lands to the east, vast and rich, were known but not fully controlled by Greek powers. They represented both opportunity and challenge. When Alexander came to power, he stepped into this environment with both the tools and the expectations that had been built before him. His position was not without difficulty. Leadership required consolidation, and stability had to be secured before any major campaign could begin. Early actions focused on ensuring that his authority was recognized and that potential resistance was managed. Once this foundation was in place, attention turned outward. The decision to move east was not simply about expansion. It was about engaging with a larger world, one that had long been connected through trade, conflict, and influence. The campaign would bring Macedonia into direct contact with a major empire that had dominated the region for generations. The beginning of the campaign was marked by movement rather than immediate large-scale conflict. Forces advanced carefully, maintaining organization and preparing for encounters that would test their strength. This approach allowed Alexander to maintain control over his army while adapting to new environments. When the first major engagements took place, they revealed the effectiveness of the Macedonian system. Coordination between different parts of the army allowed for responses that were both structured and flexible. These early successes established momentum, showing that the campaign could move forward with confidence. However, the challenges ahead were significant. The empire that Alexander was confronting was vast, with resources and manpower that extended across a wide area. Defeating it would not be a matter of a single battle, but a series of actions that would gradually shift control. As the campaign continued, movement remained a key element. Speed allowed Alexander to reach positions before his opponents could fully prepare, while discipline ensured that his forces remained effective over long distances. This combination created opportunities that were used to maintain progress. At the same time, each new region brought its own conditions. Terrain, climate, and local structures all influenced how the campaign unfolded. Adapting to these differences required careful planning and the ability to adjust strategy when needed. The encounters that followed were not identical. Each carried its own challenges and required its own response. Some were direct engagements, where the outcome depended on coordination and timing. Others involved positioning and control, where movement and preparation played a larger role. As victories accumulated, the scale of the campaign became more apparent. What had begun as an expansion was now developing into something larger, a series of conquests that extended beyond initial expectations. The question was no longer whether the campaign would succeed in the short term, but how far it would go. The impact of these actions was not limited to territory alone. Each step forward changed the structure of the regions involved. Systems of control shifted, and new connections were formed. The campaign was reshaping not only political boundaries, but also the relationships between different parts of the world. For those involved, the experience of the campaign was defined by constant movement. There was little time for rest, and each phase led directly into the next. Maintaining cohesion under these conditions required strong organization and clear direction. As the first phase of Alexander's conquests came to a close, the foundation had been set for what would follow. The initial successes had demonstrated the strength of the Macedonian system and the potential of the campaign. At the same time, they had revealed the scale of the task ahead. The path forward would lead deeper into unfamiliar territory, where the challenges would grow and the stakes would become even higher. What had already been achieved was significant, but it was only the beginning of a much larger story. As the campaign moved forward, it began to enter a phase where direct confrontation with the Persian Empire became unavoidable. The early progress had established momentum, but it had not yet resolved the central challenge. The empire Alexander faced was not a single force waiting in one place. It was a vast system, capable of drawing strength from many regions, adapting to pressure, and continuing even after local defeats. The first major encounters with Persian forces revealed the contrast between the two sides. On one hand, there was a large and established empire, with resources spread across great distances and the ability to assemble significant armies. On the other, there was a highly organized and mobile force, smaller in size, but designed to operate with precision and coordination. When these forces met, the outcome depended not only on numbers, but on how effectively each side used its structure. The Macedonian army operated as a unified system, where infantry, cavalry, and support elements worked together in a coordinated way. This allowed for flexibility during battle, where adjustments could be made in response to changing conditions. The Persian forces, while large and capable, often relied on the scale of their numbers and the strength of their position. In some cases, this created challenges in coordination, especially when facing an opponent that moved quickly and adapted during engagement. These differences began to shape the pattern of the campaign. As battles unfolded, Alexander's approach combined careful planning with decisive action. He did not rely on a single method, but adjusted based on terrain, timing, and the structure of the opposing force. This adaptability allowed him to take advantage of opportunities that might not have been visible in a more rigid system. Each major engagement carried weight beyond its immediate result. Victories opened paths forward, allowing the campaign to continue deeper into the empire. At the same time, they affected morale and perception. Success reinforced confidence among Alexander's forces, while placing pressure on the opposing side to respond. Movement remained a central element throughout this phase. Rather than remaining fixed in one area, the campaign continued to advance, maintaining momentum and limiting the ability of the Persian system to stabilize. This constant motion made it difficult to form a consistent defensive position. As the campaign pushed further, it reached key centers that held both symbolic and strategic importance. These locations were not only valuable in terms of resources, but also represented control within the broader structure of the empire. Securing them had an impact that extended beyond the immediate region. The process of taking control was not always based on direct conflict alone. In some cases, cities and regions were incorporated through negotiation or acceptance of new leadership. In others, resistance required more direct action. The variation in these outcomes reflected the complexity of the empire and the different conditions across its territory. As more areas came under control, the nature of the campaign began to change. It was no longer only about defeating opposing forces, but also about managing what had been gained. This required attention to administration, organization, and the integration of different regions into a functioning system. At the same time, the Persian leadership continued to respond. The ability to draw on resources from across a wide area allowed for repeated efforts to resist and reorganize. This meant that the campaign could not rely on a single decisive moment. Instead, it required continued effort to maintain pressure and limit the capacity for recovery. The scale of the operations increased as the campaign progressed. Distances grew longer, supply lines extended further, and coordination became more complex. Maintaining effectiveness under these conditions required careful planning and a strong structure within the army. Despite these challenges, the momentum of the campaign continued. Each successful engagement and each secured position added to the overall movement forward. The combination of speed, coordination, and adaptability allowed Alexander's forces to operate effectively even as the environment changed. However, the deeper the campaign moved into the empire, the more demanding it became. Terrain varied, climates shifted, and the distance from the original base increased. These factors added pressure to an already complex operation, requiring constant adjustment. At this stage, the campaign had clearly moved beyond its initial scope. What had begun as an effort to confront a major power was now becoming a transformation of the entire region. The Persian Empire, once stable and extensive, was being reshaped through a series of actions that connected military success with structural change. The outcome of this phase was not defined by a single battle, but by the cumulative effect of many engagements and decisions. Control shifted gradually as each step built upon the last. The empire did not fall in one moment, but through a process where its ability to maintain cohesion was steadily reduced. As this phase came to a close, the position of Alexander had changed significantly. He was no longer simply leading a campaign into foreign territory. He was now at the center of a system that included vast lands, diverse populations, and a structure that required ongoing management. The question that emerged at this point was not only how far the campaign could go, but how it could be sustained. The challenges ahead would involve not just conquest, but the ability to hold and integrate what had already been achieved. This transition marked the beginning of a new stage, where expansion would continue, but under conditions that were more complex and demanding than before. The successes of this phase had opened the path forward, but they had also created responsibilities that would shape everything that followed. As the campaign moved beyond the central regions of the Persian Empire, it entered a phase where distance, environment, and time began to reshape the nature of the effort. The earlier stages have been defined by momentum and a series of clear advances. But now the path forward led into territories that were less familiar, more varied, and more difficult to control through simple movement and force. The structure that had once been an opposing empire was no longer unified in the same way. Instead of facing a single organized system, the campaign now encountered a range of regions, each with its own conditions, leadership, and response. This created a different kind of challenge. Progress could no longer rely on defeating a central authority alone. It required dealing with many smaller and shifting centers of resistance. Movement continued to play a central role, but became more complex. Distances increased, and the routes taken were not always straightforward. Mountains, rivers, and open landscapes each demanded different approaches. The army had to remain organized while adapting to these changing conditions, maintaining cohesion even as the environment shifted around it. At the same time, the question of supply became more important. Earlier in the campaign, access to established routes and resources had supported continued movement. Now, operating further from those bases required new methods of support. Planning had to account for longer distances and fewer reliable connections. Despite these challenges, the campaign continued to expand. Each new region added to the scale of what had already been achieved. The sense of momentum remained, but it was now accompanied by a growing awareness of the limits that came with such an extended effort. As control spread, the responsibility of managing it grew as well. Governing distant territories required more than presence. It required systems that could function without constant direct oversight. This meant establishing structures that could maintain order and stability across a wide and diverse area. The process of integration was not uniform. In some places, local systems were adapted and allowed to continue under new leadership. In others, changes were more direct. These variations reflected the complexity of the regions involved and the need to balance control with practicality. Within the army, the experience of the campaign was changing. The earlier phases had been marked by clear objectives and visible progress. Now, the goals were broader and less defined. The sense of moving toward a known end began to give way to a more open and uncertain direction. This shift affected how the campaign was understood by those involved. Success was no longer measured only by victories in battle, but by the ability to continue operating across distance and time. The demands placed on the army increased, requiring both physical endurance and mental resilience. Encounters during this phase varied widely. Some were direct engagements with organized forces, while others involved smaller, more scattered resistance. Each required a different approach, and the ability to adapt became even more important. The further the campaign moved, the more it became clear that expansion alone could not define its success. Holding what had been gained and maintaining stability became equally important. This balance between movement and control shaped the decisions that followed. At the same time, the ambition that had driven the campaign did not diminish. The idea of continuing forward remained strong, even as the challenges grew. This created a tension between what was possible and what was desired, a tension that influenced both strategy and pace. As new territories were reached, the environment itself became a factor that could not be ignored. Climate, geography, and distance all affected how operations could be carried out. These were not obstacles that could be removed, but conditions that had to be managed. Over time, the cumulative effect of these factors began to shape the overall direction of the campaign. Progress continued, but it was no longer as rapid or as straightforward as before. Each step required more consideration, more preparation, and more effort to sustain. Within this extended phase, moments of success were balanced by the recognition of limits. The campaign had achieved a scale that was already significant, and continuing beyond that scale introduced increasing complexity. The question was no longer simply how far the campaign could go, but how it could maintain coherence as it expanded. As the army moved deeper into new regions, the distance from its original base became more than a physical measure. It represented a separation from the conditions that had supported the early stages of the campaign. Recreating those conditions in a different environment required adaptation and constant adjustment. This phase of the campaign highlighted the relationship between ambition and structure. Ambition drove movement forward, while structure determined how that movement could be sustained. When the two were aligned, progress was steady. When they began to diverge, challenges became more visible. By the later part of this stage, the campaign had reached a point where its scale alone influenced its direction. The larger it became, the more difficult it was to manage as a single, unified effort. Decisions carried wider consequences, and the margin for error became smaller. The achievements of this phase were significant, but they also revealed the limits of continuous expansion. The idea of an endless advance gave way to a more measured understanding of what could be held and maintained. As this stage came to a close, the campaign stood at a point where its future direction would be shaped not only by opportunity, but by the realities it had encountered along the way. The path forward remained open, but it would require decisions that balanced ambition with sustainability. As the campaign moved further into the eastern regions, it entered a stage where momentum alone could no longer define its direction. The earlier phases had been driven by a clear pattern of advance, where each success opened the path to the next. Now, that pattern began to slow, not because the ability to move forward had disappeared, but because the conditions surrounding that movement had changed in fundamental ways. Distance had become a constant presence. The lands that had once connected easily to the base of operations were now far behind, and the effort required to maintain communication, supply, and coordination had increased steadily. Each new step forward extended that distance further, adding pressure to a system that was already operating at a high level of demand. The environment itself played a larger role during this phase. Terrain shifted from one region to another, requiring continuous adjustment. Wide open areas demanded different strategies than narrow passages or elevated ground. Rivers, seasonal changes, and unfamiliar landscapes all influenced how the army could move and operate. These were not isolated challenges, but ongoing conditions that shaped every decision. At the same time, the structure of resistance had changed. Earlier in the campaign, opposition had often been organized under larger systems that could be confronted directly. Now, resistance appeared in more varied forms, sometimes organized, sometimes scattered, but often persistent. This required a different approach, one that balanced movement with the need to secure what had already been gained. As the campaign extended deeper, the question of sustainability became more important. It was no longer enough to achieve victory in individual engagements. The ability to hold territory, maintain order, and ensure continued operation became central to the success of the entire effort. Each new region added to the complexity of this task. Within the army, the experience of the campaign had changed over time. What had once felt like a series of clear advances now felt more like a continuous effort without a defined end. The sense of purpose remained, but it was now accompanied by a growing awareness of the scale of what had already been achieved and the cost of continuing further. This shift did not happen suddenly. It developed gradually, as the realities of distance, environment, and time made themselves felt. The army remained capable, organized, and disciplined, but the conditions under which it operated required more from it than before. At the same time, ambition continued to play a role. The idea of pushing further, of reaching new lands, and extending influence even more, remained present. This created a balance between the desire to continue and the recognition of the limits that were becoming clearer with each step. Encounters during this phase reflected this balance. Some engagements demonstrated continued strength and effectiveness, showing that the Army could still achieve success even under challenging conditions. Others revealed the difficulty of operating at such a distance, where coordination and support were harder to maintain. As time passed, the cumulative effect of the campaign began to shape the overall direction more strongly than any single event. The achievements were significant, but they came with a growing complexity that could not be ignored. Each decision carried wider consequences, affecting not only immediate outcomes, but the stability of the entire system. The turning point of this phase was not defined by a single moment, but by a gradual change in perspective. The idea of continuous expansion began to be weighed against the realities of maintaining what had already been achieved. The question shifted from how far the campaign could go to how it could remain stable and effective. This change influenced both strategy and pace. Movement became more measured, and decisions were made with greater attention to long-term impact. The focus expanded beyond immediate success to include the ability to sustain the entire structure over time. The relationship between leadership and the Army also became more significant. Maintaining cohesion required not only clear direction, but also an understanding of the conditions faced by those carrying out the campaign. The ability to balance ambition with practical limits became central to maintaining unity. As the campaign reached its furthest points, the scale of what had been accomplished became fully visible. The territories connected through this effort extended across vast distances, linking regions that had once been separate. This achievement reflected not only military success, but also the ability to organize and sustain a complex operation over time. Yet with this scale came the recognition that further expansion would require even greater effort. The conditions that had allowed earlier progress could not simply be extended indefinitely. Each additional step would increase the demands on an already stretched system. This realization marked the beginning of a transition. The campaign, which had been defined by forward movement, began to consider the possibility of consolidation. Holding and organizing what had been gained became as important as seeking new advances. The atmosphere during this stage was shaped by this balance. There was still strength, still capability, and still the potential for further action. But there was also a growing awareness that the path forward was no longer as clear as it had once been. As this phase came to a close, the campaign stood at a point where its direction would be determined by how these factors were resolved. The achievements of the past remained, but the future required a different kind of decision. Whether to continue forward or to stabilize what had been built would shape the final stage of the journey. As the campaign reached its furthest extent, the nature of the journey began to change in a way that was both gradual and unavoidable. The long movement outward, driven by ambition and sustained by momentum, had carried the army across vast distances and through many different regions. Now, the question was no longer how far that movement could continue, but how it could be brought into a form that could endure. The decision to turn back was not a simple reversal. It was the result of accumulated experience, shaped by the realities of distance, environment, and the demands placed on both the army and the system that supported it. The path that had once been defined by forward motion now became one of return, but the conditions of that return were as complex as the advance itself. Movement back through these regions required as much attention as the initial campaign. The territories that had been passed through were no longer distant or unfamiliar, but they were not entirely stable either. Maintaining order, ensuring supply, and preserving cohesion remained essential. Each step of the return had to account for what had changed during the years of expansion. At the same time, the scale of what had been created became more visible. The campaign had connected lands that had once existed separately, bringing them into a broader structure that extended across a wide area. This structure was not yet fully formed, and its future depended on how it would be managed. As the journey continued, the focus began to shift from conquest to organization. Establishing systems that could function across distance required careful planning. Local administration, communication, and coordination all had to be considered in ways that went beyond the immediate needs of the campaign. This transition brought new challenges. Leading an expanding force in motion required one kind of skill. Managing a vast and diverse set of territories required another. The ability to move quickly and respond to changing conditions remained important, but it now had to be balanced with the need for stability and continuity. Within the army, the experience of the campaign had left a lasting impact. The long years of movement, engagement, and adaptation had shaped those involved in ways that could not easily be set aside. The return did not erase these experiences, but carried them forward into a different phase. The relationship between leadership and the army remained central during this time. Maintaining cohesion required clear direction, but also an understanding of the accumulated strain. The balance between ambition and practicality, which had been a theme in the later stages of the campaign, continued to influence decisions. As the return progressed, the effort to define what had been achieved became more important. The territories connected through the campaign represented more than a series of victories. They formed a network that could influence trade, culture, and communication across a wide area. This potential was significant, but it required stability to be realized. At the same time, the limits of what could be controlled directly were becoming clearer. The vastness of the territories meant that no single center could manage every detail. Systems had to be established that allowed for local operation while maintaining overall connection. This process of organization was ongoing when the campaign reached its final stage. The focus had shifted almost entirely from expansion to consolidation, from movement to structure. The question was no longer how to extend the reach further, but how to sustain what had already been created. It was during this period, as these efforts were still developing, that the campaign came to an unexpected end. The loss of its central leadership brought an immediate change to the situation. The system that had been held together through direction and coordination now faced the challenge of continuing without that unifying presence. The impact of this moment was significant. Without a clear plan for succession that could maintain the same level of control, the structure began to shift. Different parts of the system responded in different ways, reflecting the diversity of the regions involved and the complexity of the connections between them. What followed was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual transformation. The territories that had been brought together did not disappear, but they did not remain unified in the same way. Instead, they began to form new arrangements, influenced by local conditions and leadership. Despite this change, the effects of the campaign did not end. The connections that had been created continued to exist, influencing movement exchange, and interaction across regions that had once been more separate. The impact was not only political, but also cultural and economic. The legacy of the campaign can be understood in several ways. On one level, it represents a series of conquests that reshaped the map of the known world. On another, it reflects the ability to connect distant regions into a broader system, even if that system did not remain unified. It also highlights the relationship between ambition and limitation. The campaign demonstrated how far coordinated effort and strong leadership could extend influence. At the same time, it showed that expansion on such a scale brings challenges that cannot be resolved by movement alone. The final years of the campaign, marked by the shift from expansion to consolidation, reveal the complexity of turning success into stability. Conquest can create opportunity, but maintaining that opportunity requires structure, planning, and time. As the story comes to a close, what remains is not only the record of what was achieved, but the understanding of how it was achieved and what followed. The campaign stands as an example of how ambition, organization, and adaptability can combine to produce outcomes that extend far beyond their starting point. It also serves as a reminder that even the most extensive efforts are shaped by the conditions in which they exist. Distance, environment, and time all play a role in determining what can be sustained. In the end, the conquests of Alexander form a narrative that moves from preparation to expansion, from expansion to challenge, and from challenge to transformation. The path does not end with a single moment, but with a series of changes that continue to influence what comes after. The journey began with a vision shaped by earlier foundations, and it concluded with a legacy that extended beyond the life of the one who led it. Between those points lies a story of movement, decision, and the constant balance between what is possible and what can be maintained.